Good morning, welcome to NMS. I want to go through the different macronutrients with you and what your body can and can't do with them. Now, specifically, I'm going to talk about carbohydrates as being glucose, and then I'm going to talk about fatty acids, and I'm going to talk about proteins as being amino acids and what your body will do with them in different situations. Now, let's look at a surplus. So in a surplus, okay, your body has enough energy, it's got too much energy, and you're taking in, let's say, even in a diet that, let's say, is high carbohydrate, it is moderate fats, moderate protein. In a surplus, your body is going to store fat. Now, it's not necessarily going to use the carbohydrates for fat, okay? It's going to use the fatty acids for fat, okay? But your insulin levels are going to be higher as well, which basically means that, you're going to be in a fat storage mode. Now, that doesn't mean that you're using the carbohydrates for fat storage. That means that you're storing fat, okay? When your insulin levels are elevated, you're storing fat. Now, what can it do with fatty acids at that time? Well, fatty acids cannot become amino acids or sugar, we know that, okay? So fatty acids are going to be used for storage. They're not going to be broken down into ketones because you don't need ketones, because you've got plenty of energy coming from fats and from carbohydrates in the form of glucose, that your body is not going to be too worried about that. And it's certainly not going to break down proteins as well. So if you're taking in plenty of protein in the form of, like, obviously, and those amino acids that come from that protein, they're not going to be converted into any glucose because it's not necessary. And it's very unlikely that proteins are going to be converted into fat as well, okay, because there's fat that the body can do with that, okay. Now let's talk about more of a maintenance diet, okay, so we're at maintenance now. Now that means you're getting just enough calories in, give or take. I mean, it's not a perfect science, so some days you might be a little bit above, some days you might be a little bit below, but ordinarily, okay, you're eating enough food to survive. Now, obviously, the glucose, well, you've got enough glucose, you don't have to worry about energy. Fat storage is not really it's going to be happening after meals, but it's also you're going to be using fat in between meals, okay? And the protein, well, in the form of amino acids, that's probably going to be used maybe for muscle building, okay? But the body is also aware that it's got just enough nutrients, so in between meals, maybe you break down some of those glucogenic amino acids and convert it to glucose. And then when you're fed, you'll use most of those amino acids to form protein, okay? Now, this is not a perfect science, so it depends on, when you eat and how much you eat as to, like at each meal, as to what your body's doing. But overall, you're not really going to go and gain body fat, okay? You're not really going to lose body fat. Your body may build some muscle, from the amino acids you're having. It depends on how much protein you're really having and how much amino acids it really has, as to whether you put on muscle as well. Generally, you're in sort of, a stable mode. Now, let's look at a deficit, okay? Because a lot of people think that certain things happen in deficit, and I can tell you this now, they're not going to. Okay, so let's look at, you're in a deficit. So what happens to glucose? Well, generally speaking, in a deficit, you probably don't have enough glucose, all right? But if you're in a ketogenic type deficit, you've got very low glucose, in which case your body's going to break down a lot of those glucogenic amino acids that it's got from the protein, and it's going to convert it into glucose, because some cells cannot use fat for energy. They can only use glucose for energy, the heart specifically, okay? The brain can use ketone bodies, okay, for energy, 2 out of the 3. Obviously, acetone it cannot use for energy, but the other 2 ketone bodies it can use for energy, but it doesn't like to, okay? And generally speaking, when people go into a ketone diet, okay, or ketogenic diet, they get headaches because, your body's not getting the glucose it needs. Now, let's say for argument's sake, now you're on more of a low-fat diet and a higher carbohydrate diet, which let's look at glucose. So your body still has a bit of glucose. It doesn't need to break down as much of the protein, okay? But you're not going to be burning as many fats because you don't have as much fat. You're going to be burning more preferentially glucose. But you're not going to be, you're going to be losing a similar amount of fat, because if you're on a ketogenic diet, your body will use more fat for energy, preferentially. But when you're on a higher glucose, lower fatty acid diet, you're going to use glucose for energy, and you're going to use some fats for energy. But the end result is that you're going to burn a certain amount of energy stored as fats in order to go and, obviously feed your body for the energy it needs. But you are going to be breaking down some amino acids, okay, but less, because carbohydrates or glucose generally is protein or amino acid sparing. But you may use some of them in between meals when you don't have enough glucose, to keep your glucose levels running, to keep your heart running, to keep your brain working, okay? Now, people tend to believe that if you eat a lot of carbohydrates, that you're going to put you're going to store a lot of fat. Not true, okay? You're only going to do that in a surplus, but you're probably not going to use much of those carbohydrates, because unless you're really, really biased towards more carbohydrates and very low fat, even in the surplus, you're more than likely going to be using the fats you ingest, okay? So I hope that sort of gives you a bit of a rundown of what happens in various scenarios. But generally speaking, your body likes to maintain homeostasis, okay? So if you're missing something, it will find a way to create it, or it will use something else, okay? But it generally always needs to maintain a certain glucose level, okay? The less glucose you take in, or carbohydrates you take in, the lower the glucose level will be most of the time. The more fats you take in, the more preferentially it'll use fats for energy, but at the same time, it still needs glucose, so it's going to break down some of those glucogenic amino acids. So I hope this sort of makes sense to you. If this needs to be more explained maybe in another post, by all means ask away. If there's something you're not sure of, ask away. I'm trying to put these sort of videos up so you can have a good understanding. Sometimes they get a bit lengthy, but it's no easy to explain some of the biochemistry that goes on in the body, okay? It is quite complex, and it does, matter depending on what you're eating at the time. So like, comment, share this video, ask questions, follow me. I'm trying to put up more useful videos for you to explain a lot of different biochemistry. I do have qualifications in chemistry and biochemistry, and it gives me the ability to explain it a little bit more in depth. Thanks for listening, guys, and hopefully that video helps, and I'll talk to you next time.